Thanks for being here. This is the Brand Gravity Show, where we explore the intersection between branding and psychology. I'm your host, psychology-driven brand strategist, and today we are through and through living up to our name. I had a mind-blowing conversation with Chloé, who is a fellow branding nerd, and we dug into the research that she's been doing around the science of visibility and how visibility is truly a uneven landscape depending on who you are as a brand builder and what to do about that. I hope you enjoy Chloé as much as I do. She is freaking brilliant, and I know there's so much to learn. And Chloé Nwangwu is the brand strategist, a brand visibility advisor and consultant for underrecognized social impact brands and public figures. Her job is to make these brands impossible to ignore. She's advised everyone from a small Black family-owned mom and pop shop to the first refugee delegation to the UN. Many of those clients have gone on to be better seen, heard, and respected, and resourced. That's looked like celebrity endorsements, seats at previously inaccessible tables, and hundreds of thousands of dollars. Her signature approach comes down to a science-backed understanding of what it takes to get the under-recognized the attention and recognition their work deserves. And Chloé lives in the US, where she wrestles with an addiction to D&D and tends to her giant baby Yoda plushie. Let's get into our conversation. So what's been your story so far? Can you give us the quick origin of Chloé?
Oh my gosh, yes. So my relationship with brands and what I've come to call brand science actually began with my role as an international mediator. I know this is strange, but hang on with me. I was trained to facilitate peace negotiations between nations and in the context of civil wars. And because of that, I'd also be called on to advise in a bunch of similar sorts of situations. So I was actually tapped to advise on the civil war in Yemen, right? But what I didn't know at the time is that this group that I was consulting with, they weren't actually in the negotiations. In fact, they weren't even at, like, as far as the UN peace process was concerned, this group was not relevant, even though they were a pretty big piece of the population. And so what that taught me is that there are people, groups, who, despite being integral to like actual solutions and those solutions sticking, weren't even making it in the door. And I know that in these sorts of negotiations at this level that you don't get in the door unless you're impossible to ignore. And so that was sort of when I was like, okay, cool, bet. Then that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to make groups and people who are under-recognized impossible to ignore so that they can enter into the spaces that matter to their work. And that's really how it started. And I started doing research, and that eventually led me to brands as a really wonderful lever for influencing human behavior, as you well know. And the rest is kind of history. So like that's kind of like a very brief history of Chloé getting into brands.
Amazing. I didn't realize this about you, that you're such a badass. Excuse my language.
Oh my gosh, I'm delighted by this now. Oh.
Amazing. Okay, let's bring this down and sink it into the practicality. How are you helping people right now? Like what is your main offer? What are you doing with people?
Yeah, totally. So my main offer is something that I call the Visibility OS. And either I am advising you with this or my team is sort of building yours or like refining yours. And what it is it's actually a visibility strategy system, I would call it. And what that does is, yes, you get all the things that you want from like a brand dashboard, right? So like you can have the 30-foot view of your brand, and then you can drill down into details like PhD dissertation level details if you want to, right? But the key thing here is that it also equips you and your team to create the situations and conditions, I might say, for your getting the attention and recognition your work deserves, right? Like science is very clear about how to do that. And so yeah, so that's my main offer. And I sort of decided to specialize in underrecognized public figures, just like underrecognized folks, largely because their relationship with visibility is a little bit more complicated. And as it turns out, science is also bearing that out. Like we're empirically being able to sort of trace why that's the case and what we can do about it. So, yeah.
Amazing. Amazing. And you know that I am a geek for the science. So I want to dive into all of the research that you've been doing. What's been the most surprising insight that you've garnered so far about the science of visibility?
Yeah. Okay, so I might start off with two things, right? The first thing I might say is the ways in which our ability to pay attention to things has been compromised given the global panini pandemic, whatever you want to call it, right? That we were already sort of limited in the amount of things that we could pay attention to, right? And everybody is aware that there's like more and more content than ever that's bombarding us every day, right? But what I didn't realize until I started looking into it is that because of because of the very special circumstances of the pandemic, right? Our brain's filters are sort of in overdrive, right? And I'll get a little bit more specific about what I mean about that. So, because we were all at home, right? We were sort of held hostage. I know that that sounds terrible, but we were sort of held hostage to all of this content and all of this data in ways that we hadn't been before, right? And that led to a kind of fatigue, right? Add to that the fact that in the time of the pandemic, there was always this sort of heightened threat assessment or awareness that everyone had, right? Everyone was always sort of looking for danger at every corner. And so that's kind of led to like the combination of those two things has sort of led to something I call attentional overload, but really it's an attentional fatigue. And that means that our ability, like I said, to pay attention to things, our resources for paying attention to things are more limited now in this weird liminal transition space that we're currently in. And that has a lot of bearing, a lot of consequences when it comes to visibility in general, but when it comes to visibility and brands and leveraging those things to invite more demand for what it is that you happen to do. So I would say that's the first thing. Yeah. Questions, go,
Yeah.
please.
I don't want to derail you because I know you have a second thing.
Yeah.
And knowing my brain will go off on a tangent, but I just had to acknowledge, or I had the aha moment. It's not only that we were bombarded with so much data, but like you said, it was all on this like base primal fear level
Yeah.
that we were all trying to make sure that ourselves were safe and our families were safe, that it really did monopolize our attention for so long.
Yeah.
And there was just this constant stream. I recognized it in myself. I was like, why can't I get anything done? Or like, why can't I operate at the same level that I was previous to all of that coming to light?
Yeah.
And it makes so much sense. And it absolutely affects how entrepreneurs are going to approach visibility. We'll get into that part next. But do you still remember your second point?
Yes, I do. I still remember my second point. And this is going to feel like bad news, but it's technically bad news and good news. and it is this. So when it comes to visibility, there are things that I've colloquially, started calling visibility biases. And I'm sure, because your audience is very smart, I'm sure everyone knows about like cognitive biases just in general, right? But what we haven't really examined or explored, and what a key part of my work involves, is looking at visibility biases. And I will tell you some of the research that I've read on one in particular that is, again, frustrating and sounds like bad news, but also is good news. So it's this. There was some research that came out, I want to say 2021, that shows that, I feel bad about this. Okay. That shows that even when folks see what you do as relevant, even in that situation, which in our field we would call brand salience, right? Like even when you have that scenario, if you are a Black American, your white peers are 33% more likely to overlook you. Yeah. And these scientists called this phenomenon the racial attention deficit. Now, the reason that I bring this up is because they empirically demonstrated that even when you have salience, this is the case, right? Forget all of the others who don't have the opportunity necessarily yet to refine and position their brands so that they do have salience, right? Even when you do, 33% more likely to be overlooked. And this exists on a spectrum, right? This is a very limited look at race, but this exists on a spectrum, right? There's gender can affect this, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, right? All of this exists on the
Yeah.
spectrum, right? So if you are a woman, right, you exist somewhere on this spectrum. If you are, as this study showed, a Black American or a Black American woman, right? If you are trans, if you, again, a spectrum when it comes to how likely, or I might say the ways in which folks have been conditioned to overlook you. So
Mm.
that
Mm.
is, yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, that's okay. I imagine that there are systemic shifts that need to happen. Obviously, there are systemic shifts that need to happen on the side of the individual, the brand, the entrepreneur who's facing this. What tools are in their toolbox to earn some of that visibility?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And so this is why I say that it sounds like bad news, and technically it is, but it is also good news. And here's why. One, if folks have sort of been grinding away at the visibility game, right, and then they've looked at their peers who might enjoy, let's say, more environmental protections than they do, and they see, oh, like I'm doing the same or similar things to this person and they're a bit further along. Why is that? The good news is that you're not imagining that, right? You're actually being required by society to pay something I call an invisibility tax, which is an extra amount of time, energy, money, sometimes a combination of all three, to get to the same sort of results, right? So you're not imagining that. And what that means is that because this is really just an issue of attention, we can look at the ways in which the brain works and say, okay, cool. How do we navigate around this invisibility tax and all of these other visibility biases? Now, a good brand and excellent branding are like the best tools that you have when it comes to this, right? And very specifically, you want to focus on the memorability of your brand. And this gets into, in fact, I feel like I should do like a quick primer on how the brain works very
Yeah,
quickly.
let's do that.
Yeah.
Let's do that. Yeah.
Yeah. So that all of that stuff makes sense in context. So,
Yeah.
okay. So very quickly, this is the brain on visibility, right? So we will just be minding our own businesses, right? And then we'll see something, right? Or we will hear something or smell something, right? All of the different stimuluses that exist in our environment, right, will sort of be picked up by the various sensors that our body has: eyes, nose, skin, all of those things, right? And all of those inputs, all of those signals are held for a very brief time in sort of a sensory memory place, and then quickly are moved over to something called short-term memory, right? And while they are in short-term memory, this is when the brain's filters comes around and says, okay, cool. What are things that should get to long-term memory? What are things that should not? And this comes to the attentional overload that I was talking about, right? Because the brain's filters are now in overdrive, so they're very judicious about what makes it past those filters, right? And so the things that are salient, are memorable, that feel like they will be useful later, those are the things that get into long-term memory, right? So that's the brain on visibility. The visibility means get past the brain's filters. That is the goal, right? And then we get to the part of the process, which is sort of the brain on brands, right? So when we look at brands from a scientific perspective, all they really are is a system of ideas that influences the behavior of other people, right? And we know this because when we look at long-term memory, we understand it to be just this constellation of interrelated memories and ideas. And what a brand is just a certain cluster of those memories and those ideas, right? Now,
Mm.
the brain on brands means that if you want a brand that is going to be easy to remember, right? That's the whole point of being memorable. You have to be as strategic as possible when it comes to placing your brand in this memory network, in this sort of constellation, right? And that's because when somebody is making a decision, whether that's buy here, donate now, vote, what they then do is that they consult their long-term memory. They consult this constellation of ideas, and they will pull from anything that seems relevant to the decision that they're trying to make to create the context for the decision that they're making, right? And so that means that when it comes to buying, for example, let's talk with your audience, they will pull out a short list, let's say, of possible candidates, maybe 4 or 5 people who seem relevant that they then are going to go and research, right? So that's sort of the brain on brands. That's why positioning and brand strategy and all of these things are so important, because what they allow you to do is strategically select where in this constellation of memories you're going to place yourself. And then they allow you to, and this is important, refresh those memories over time, which is also why people say repetition is so important. Now, I say all of this, right? Because when it comes to tools that you have in your toolkit to navigate around the invisibility tax and other visibility biases, right? Research is showing that there are certain ways of being memorable. There's certain kinds of memorability that are especially suited to recall or being remembered, being pulled from that constellation of memories and getting past the brain's filters, right? So like those two places where your brand might get lost or overlooked or ignored. If we apply those things to how we build brands, how we shape brands, how we design the branding and language and things around brands, then folks have a much better chance of navigating around all of those things. I hope that wasn't too abstract. I know it can get so. Ask questions if it was.
No, that was beautiful. And I love how you describe everything. What are those two things that make brands or anything more memorable?
Yeah. Okay. So there are a number of things. There's more
Yeah.
than two, but
Okay. Yeah.
okay. So for example, color is something that is, I mean, really any sort of all the sensory inputs that we've got. So like color, smell, so how things feel tactilely, things that we hear, right? All of those things, multi-sensory branding. Let me just give it a name, right?
Yeah.
Multi-sensory
Yeah.
branding is something that absolutely, please for the love of God, leverage this, right? And the reason I say this is one, color and visual stimulus is, it's not the fastest thing that we process, but it's the thing that we remember most easily, right? And so,
Yeah.
for example, when I'm advising folks, if you are trying to pick your brand colors, for example, right? Please do not pick colors that you like, okay? Please don't even pick colors that are commonly used in your industry, right? What you want to do is pick a combination of things that make you look like you belong in your industry, right? And things that
Hmm.
break the mold or the code that your industry is familiar with, right? So when it comes to picking your color palette, boom, boom, there you go, right?
Hmm.
But you don't want to stay in the visual medium alone. So you want to try and employ some of these other senses. So that means smell, if you can, right? Having a signature scent. If you can, absolutely do this, right? If you can have a jingle developed for you. Folks wonder why jingles are developed for brands. It's because sound is one of the senses that I believe it's the sense that we pick up on the most quickly. And so
Mm.
sound is something that is so underutilized that it's like wide open for helping develop memorability, right? So I would say just multi-sensory branding, just in general, is something that folks should leverage. Try to leverage at least 2 senses when you are developing your brand, because that's going to contribute to the memorability of it. So that's one thing, right? Second thing is that when it comes to folks who are under-recognized, right? And so those are folks who are uniquely affected by visibility biases, like the invisibility tax, what you want to realize is that you actually have a whole constellation of stakeholders that you want to be paying attention to, that it is a mistake to only focus on the folks that you want to have buying from you or the folks that you want to have supporting you. It is a mistake to only focus on them. And that's largely because in my research, I found at least five in total stakeholders that are really important for the success and continued flourishing of underrecognized brands. The one that I found folks underestimate or ignore the most is the gatekeeper, right? Every single underrecognized leader has gatekeepers around them that if you understand their motivations and sort of what makes them tick as much, if not more, than you do the folks that you would like to have buy from you, you are then positioning yourself to, how might I even put this? You're removing sort of like a stopper, right? Like just imagine you're trying to pour out a bottle of water or oil or something, right? When you've got a stopper in there, like maybe a little bit leaks out. But when you have this level of understanding of this particular stakeholder, it's like removing the stopper and letting everything sort of flow. So this is another.
I love this. Let me interject really quick,
Yeah,
Chloe.
totally.
When you say a stakeholder in terms of a brand,
Mm.
what does that word mean in this context?
Yeah, absolutely. So stakeholder, when I say that, and this is, I'm borrowing language from international mediation and conflict resolution, absolutely. But when I say stakeholder, all I really mean are the group of people or the network of people who are connected to the success of a brand, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
that means who are connected to the current opportunities that you're getting right now and opportunities that you might get or might want to sort of procure or facilitate in the future, right? And
Yeah.
a lot of brands have said, okay, cool, that stakeholder is my client, my customer,
Yeah.
right? Like, and that's
Yeah.
it. As long as I know them super, super well, I am completely set. And what my research has shown is that's a mistake. Do not do this, right? That yes, that is one key stakeholder, but I mean, just imagine from your own experience as a person or a human being, right? Like when you're entering a room that is unfamiliar to you, most, I think, if not all underrecognized people share the experience of sort of needing to assess who is in the room, needing to sort of understand the power dynamics in the room, understanding like
Mm.
where you fall within all of those things. We all have that experience. Most of us, if not all, have that experience, right? It's the same with brands. It's the same with brands that not all of us have the environmental protections in place to allow for us to ignore these other stakeholders. And so, what that means is that when we are in the phase of trying to position our brand or we're doing brand strategy, right? This is sort of what we would call it in our industry. You don't just want to profile your client or your customer. You also want to profile these other 4+ stakeholders who are going to be integral for you moving forward.
We're going to get right back to the interview. For the next few seconds, I'm going to share with you my brand clarity collective and how it can help you grow your income and impact. If you're an entrepreneur who feels stuck or uncertain about what makes your brand stand out, then this is for you. The Brand Clarity Collective is a mastermind multiplied by mentorship. It's part online curriculum, part digital mastermind, and it's designed to help you get crystal clear brand clarity so you attract more perfect clients and grow your business. We have a thriving community of entrepreneurs who are all smart and driven. As a member of the collective, you get an all-access pass to all of my best branding courses, as well as access to our private community where you can connect with like-minded entrepreneurs and get feedback and support directly from me on our coaching calls. The Brand Clarity Collective is priced at just $297 per month, and after 6 months, you keep lifetime access to all of the courses. To learn more and to see if it's right for you, head over to my homepage at kayeputnam.com. There's a
big section where you can click to learn more. I'll also include the link in the show notes wherever you are listening or watching. All right, let's get back.
Let me ask another clarifying question.
Sure.
I'm so interested in this conversation because it makes so much sense. When you say the gatekeeper, are you talking about a gatekeeper to your potential client? So I'm imagining like secretary to the CEO.
Yeah.
Like, is that the gatekeeper, or is the gatekeeper somebody that is stopping you as the brand or as the entrepreneur from expressing? Like, they're gatekeeping you in some way.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a great question. I'm glad you asked. The gatekeeper can be any and all of these things, and it sort of depends on who you are, right? Like if you are a small versus a medium business owner, right? If you are in the public versus the private sector, right? Like there are lots of things that will sort of shift who or what those gatekeepers happen to be in when it comes to your brand. But I can give some examples that I have observed. So like, yes, for example, right, the secretary to the CEO, right? The HR person, like the point person, when if let's say you're trying to work with like a large corporation, right? Like whoever the main point person, the person who's out doing the research to come up with a list of candidates that the corporation is going to consider, whoever that person is, they are a gatekeeper, right? Certain journalists, right? They are gatekeepers. Let's see, what might another example be? If I'm pushing us towards the public sector, certain even interns might be, right? Like certain interns and volunteers in these organizations might be gatekeepers, right? Goodness gracious. And now I'm thinking to my time as a mediator. Like I would have been a gatekeeper as a mediator. I definitely would have been a gatekeeper. All the negotiators who represent different nation states, gatekeepers. So yeah, like the there's a wide possible collection of who and what is a gatekeeper. It just sort of depends on like who and what you are. So yeah.
Yeah. And to me, this is forcing the importance and the value of building a really large or as large of an audience as you can.
Oh my gosh, yes.
To raise your influence.
Yes.
Not like you said, not only with your potential client, but almost like within this whole industry, this whole playground that you're playing in, so that you can touch all of those different stakeholders. Yeah, such a great point. So what else do we do with this knowledge? So if it's not just our client and we need to influence or be visible to other stakeholders in this whole ecosystem, how do we do that?
Yeah. So that's a good question. Now, this comes to something that I do in particular. I'm not sure if other people do. So this sort of gets down to refining something that I call the kernel of your work, right? Like this, like a like in a piece of corn or popcorn, right? Like in the middle, you've got the kernel, right? So this comes to developing something I call the kernel of your work. And what I mean when I say this is when you've done this, you tend to understand or have documented somewhere the thing or the things that make you irresistible to each of those stakeholders, right? You could call it like an angle that you have on like sort of like the work that you do, right? But you want to have a sort of angle that you use to, is it share your work? Let me give an illustration because this might be helpful, right?
Yeah.
So let's imagine a gemstone, right? It has many different facets and angles from which it sort of glitters and shines, right? But depending on where you are standing looking at this gemstone, you're getting a different sort of like reflection or refraction, right? And so this is sort of what this means, right? That you are not going to be able to articulate your work and what you do in the same way to each of these stakeholders because they all have different motivations. They all have different things that make them tick, right? And so what you want to do is in understanding those things, find the most strategic angle from which you can sort of refract the light off of the work that you do. So that's sort of what I mean when I talk about sort of refining the kernel of your work or refining the center of your work. Don't just settle for having like a brand essence, right? Because like, yes, that's great. Do that. But also understand that brand essence or that whatever of your work, the DNA of your work, is going to be understood and interpreted differently by all of these stakeholders. And so you need to try to the best of your ability, given what you know about these stakeholders, to control what that angle is yourself, rather than allowing it to just sort of be. So that's one thing that I would say. And doing that work becomes really easy once you understand these different stakeholders, right? Once you understand who they are. Something that I tell my clients to do often is to, once we've discovered who these stakeholders are, and I'll get to how you do that in a second, because that was the second thing that came up. Once you understand who all these stakeholders are for you, going out and like trying to interview them, right? Like try to talk to some of these people. People love talking about themselves and about their work, right? So as long as you know what to ask them to get the information that you need and that you want, talk to as many of them as possible. Oh, and this just reminds me of another science thing. So I'm just going to put a pinhole in that, and we'll come to that after the second thing here. But so that's all to say, right? That you're not going to be able to understand what these strategic angles are in isolation. So you want to go out and talk to people. You want to observe their behavior. You want to do all of this stuff, right? Because as you do that, that sort of irresistible angle of yours for that particular stakeholder is going to reveal itself. It becomes pretty clear once you've spoken to and observed enough of each of those stakeholders. So that is what I'll say about that. Okay, the next thing, and I actually have a blog post that I wrote about this with some resources. So if people want to know more about this, we can probably put this in the show notes. But I have personal beef with certain aspects of strategy and branding and brand positioning. I have beef with certain things that we hold sacred within our particular field. One of those things happens to be client personas. I have real beef with them. I have real beef for so many reasons. So many reasons. So many reasons that these are just not the way. One of them largely, again, is because, like, again, this whole series of stakeholders that we've been talking about, right? But one of the things that I have found, especially if you are a brand that cares about your impact in the world, client personas or customer personas can lull you into sort of a false sense of security. And let me tell a story to sort of explain what I mean, right? So I heard the story once of this brand. I don't exactly remember what it is that they sold, right? They were a brick and mortar place, and they were opening up in sort of like a Brooklyn analog, right? And what they did is what most sort of like cool millennial-ish places do, and they have sort of payment system that's like by your cell phone, right? Which is like a cool thing that like now is very common, right? And so their ideal customer profile loved this, right? Like this was amazing for them and like was a real boon. However, the folks who lived in the community that they had placed themselves in did not find this to be a positive for them, largely because a lot of them didn't have cell phones with the technology that allowed them to pay in that way, right? And so what that meant is that they couldn't actually engage with this brand or this place. They couldn't buy anything from this brick and mortar place. And obviously that is not what this brand wanted, right? But it is an impact that they had on this community where they cut themselves off from being accessible to those people. And you're not going to see that kind of second order effect if you are focused on a client persona. You're not. What I tend to do instead is something that I call a stakeholder spectrum, right? And what that generally looks like is I have at least 3 sort of things that we want to consider. So receptivity is one that I often do, that I always do with every client, right? And so imagine with me, if you will, a scale, right? And it has 2 endpoints, right? So if we are looking at a stakeholder spectrum for receptivity, right? On one hand, we have the most receptive stakeholder. On the other end, we have the least receptive stakeholder. And somewhere in the middle, we have a stakeholder that's sort of like midway receptive, right? And so what I will have folks do is say, okay, cool. Who is the most receptive stakeholder here? Who's the least? Who's the mid? why. And we'll do that across at least 3 different spectrums. And doing that allows us to make sure that like we capture, and when I say spectrums, there's receptivity, there might be, like power, right? Like what spectrums matter, it depends on your brand, right? But what this does is this allows us to look at the network of people that we're likely to impact with our work and sort of say, okay, how do we make sure that our impact on these people is the best it possibly can be, right? So that's the second thing. Any thoughts, feelings, questions, or concerns before I move on to the next thing?
I love this so much because a lot of us entrepreneurs, especially people in my space, we are change agents.
Yeah.
We are catalysts for change. We are focused on impact often more than the money, more than the revenue.
Yeah.
And this exercise or this awareness that you're creating with your clients is just shedding a whole new light on that impact, because you're right. It's about so much more than just that single avatar.
Yeah, exactly.
So
exactly.
Love this.
Yeah.
Please continue.
Yeah. So the third thing that came to my mind is that given everything that we have just talked about today, and it is a lot, I understand that. Friends, if you need to process this, I suggest watching this video again, taking notes, bring out your little notebook, take notes, and then watch it again. Okay, that's what I suggest because there's a lot in here.
Yeah.
But what I have observed from my own research is that given all the things that we've talked about, this means that as you are developing your brand or as you are refining your brand, that there are in fact different discrete phases of visibility. And each of those phases have their own goals, have their own needs, have their own friction and places that you can slip up and things that you want to focus on ameliorating or lessening, right? And so far, I've sort of discovered, I don't want to say discovered because I'm not like, okay, maybe I'll say discovered. I've discovered, I want to say 1, 2, 3, 4 discrete phases of visibility. And when I say discrete, definition, I just mean that they are different from each other, right? That they are connected to each other, but they are not the same. So 4 different or 4 discrete phases of visibility, right? And so what this means is that very often and very easily, you can be doing the right thing at the wrong time. And so if that happens and you find yourself like beyond frustrated by the fact that this thing is not working the way you expected, it's possible and probably likely that you are utilizing probably a tactic, sometimes a strategy that is better suited to a different phase or stage of visibility than the one that you're currently in. So yeah, that's the that's the third thing that came to mind as we were talking.
What has been the most transformational book, podcast, course, resource that has changed your life or your business the most?
Oh, this is so hard. Oh my God.
I know.
Oh my goodness. Okay. Okay, so I will say, can I give 2? Can I cheat and give 2?
Yes.
Okay, amazing. So first thing I will say is that we met because I actually was in a course of yours. And this course was sort of about like creating a routine. I remember that you had this lovely app that had us like doing certain things on certain days, right? And honestly, this was one of the most impactful things I've done. And I can explain why. Allow me to explain why very quickly. Aside from the fact that I actually got to meet you in person and you were the first person to call me the brand scientist, which is now a thing people call me. Like, I remember that we said brand scientist and they were like, wait, that's kind of lame, right? But then like a month later, someone else was like, no, but you're like a brand scientist or something. And I was like, oh, okay, this might have legs, right? So aside from the fact that you're the first person to call me the brand scientist and then it just kind of stuck, the reason that this was so impactful, and again, the science supports this, is because of the phase of visibility that I happened to be in at that point, right? At that point, I was doing something that I call like a brand download, right? I was getting everything from here out so that I could sort of observe it and look at it with other people and refine it and figure out how to articulate it, right? And so what I found is that when you're in this particular phase of visibility, often folks will want to go and like jump on podcasts, write for, high visibility publications, that sort of thing, right? And then they'll find that that's not working so well for them. And that's because that's for a different phase of visibility. In this particular phase of visibility, it is really important to be in a supportive sort of group setting of folks who are like-minded, right? Almost like a mastermindy type of thing. And that's because not only are you protecting your eventually what will become your intellectual property, but not only are you protecting that from like really the really harsh world that visibility can present for it, right? Not only are you sort of like protecting it and babying it as it's coming forth, but you're also creating sort of key members in your network of people who A, will help you continue to refine this thing, and B, because they're sort of in an adjacent world, they'll be aware of your work and are more likely and are excellent candidates for broadcasting that work, right? And that gets into some recent findings that there have been in network science and the actual geometry or like shape of human relationships that are the most conducive to social change or behavior change happening at scale, right? And so your group program in particular took advantage of some of, maybe instinctually, I'm not sure, but of some of the things that were necessary for creating that kind or that particular shape of like human network. So that's one thing. That's number one that I
Amazing.
have to
Thank
shout
you.
you out. I have to shout you out because like yes,
Thank you.
absolutely the science supports that program and I'm so glad that I found it when I did. The second thing is there is this book by, I now consider her my mentor in semiotics, in commercial semiotics, which is the study of what humans make things mean, essentially, or meaning.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
so this book is called Using Semiotics in Marketing, and it is by the inimitable Rachel Laws, Dr. Rachel Laws, who is one of the founders of commercial semiotics as a field. She's incredible. I had the opportunity to do sort of like a read along where she and a colleague of hers had like a small group of people read this book when it came out and sort of develop semiotic projects of our own with like her input and her guidance. And we stayed connected ever since. And she's just the loveliest person. So please absolutely go and buy this book because this taught me so much about the proper way to apply semiotics in marketing and in commercial situations. I just learned so much from her and a lot, I think, of my chosen speciality when it comes to under-recognized folks and utilizing what we know about visibility and the brain to help them like maybe visibility scale is what I might say, comes from the work that I did with her and the conversations that we continue to have. So please absolutely go get that book, read it. It's so good. And if I can give a third resource, because now I'm cheating double time, but we might as well. So I know a lot of folks in our field know about this book called How Brands Grow, right?
Yeah.
By, it's not Adam Grant, it's another person who's like in that world. A lot of people know about this book in particular, but there's another book by someone who works at the same organization and someone who actually, I believe, helped him write that book that not a lot of people or not as many people know about, and I think that's a shame. So the author is Jenny Romaniuk. I'm definitely not pronouncing her name correctly, but you will see her name often side by side with the guy who wrote How Brands Grow. Everyone knows this guy, so I don't need to look up his name. But she wrote this book called Building Distinctive Brand Assets. And it has informed a lot of my thinking about how to, like, what is important when it comes to branding, right? And I should say that when I'm talking about a brand's branding, what I mean are just, it's the brand's brand assets, right? And in order for them to be effective, sort of like we've said, they need to be memorable, right? So this book
Yeah.
talks a lot about that, and it's so good. It's a bit dense, not gonna lie. So like, do not expect to finish it in a weekend. It's short. but it's dense. So do not expect to finish it in a weekend, but definitely give that book a look. It's been pretty formative for me. So those are the three things that
I
I would
love
say.
that.
Yeah.
I love that. I love that. Thanks for
Yeah.
cheating and giving us more than what I asked for. All right, last question.
Yeah.
If you could plant a kernel of truth or just a lesson or a knowing into everybody that is watching or listening, what would you want everybody to know?
I would say that in recent years, we have, all of us, as we're looking at sort of the sound bites that exist in the world, we've all of us sort of been taught to doubt our instincts, right? Right. If somebody feels like, oh, this is like, it might be dangerous for me to go after this thing, we call it a scarcity mindset, right? If someone is like, you know what, I'm just like, I feel like I don't have it in me, we say, oh, that's just a mental thing. Like, you got to logic your way out of that, right? And so, what I want to say is that sometimes, yes, you want to pay attention to the scripts and the patterns that your mind tends to play, right, for you. But more often than not, your instincts are just picking up on cues from the environment, right? It's neutral. Your body is just trying to keep you alive. So when you have an instinct and someone says, oh, that, imposter syndrome, like we talked about before, and someone says, oh, that's a scarcity mindset, maybe, but it is also your instincts picking up on cues on the environment and saying, hey, you might be in danger here. And if you are an under-recognized leader, chances are your instincts are right. And so I would say pay close attention to what your instincts are telling you, because there's wisdom there. And it doesn't mean that you necessarily need to be ruled by your feelings, even though that's not a bad thing. And the science supports that. And we could have a whole other podcast where I talk about where the bias against instincts and feelings comes from. It comes from a misunderstanding about how the brain works, by the way. We could do a whole thing about that. But instead of doing that, I will say, listen closely to your instincts about what they are telling you. Make sure that you're paying attention to all of those cues, and then consider the other stuff, right? And then consider saying, okay, if I do want to do this thing, how do I do that in a way that is aware of what my instincts are trying to show me? So that's what I would say. Trust your instincts and pay attention to what they're trying to protect you from.
So good. So good. Chloé, where can people go to learn more from you? You are a wealth of knowledge. This was so rich and so amazing. I would want to continue talking for hours and hours, but we'll wrap this up. So where can people continue the conversation?
Yeah. So I have a couple of bites, I will say. So if you are interested in sort of discovering more about like these different phases of visibility, for example, we didn't have a chance to talk too in depth about that, and you want to find out like what phase of visibility you happen to be in, what that means for you, right? I do these visibility clinics where we will walk you through the process of creating sort of a visibility blueprint for yourself. And so that is not free, it is paid, but if the reviews are anything to go by, worth every penny. So if you are interested in that, please, I'm sure that we'll have the link below, but it's sort of like a workshop. It's very small. I only do 10 people at a time maximum. So they're very, very small so that we can really sort of dig into this building of your visibility blueprint. So that's the first bite. If you want like a smaller nibble, I do have a sort of visibility, how might I put this? Like a diagnostic. Yeah, that's what I might say. I do have a visibility diagnostic, and what it will be good at doing is sort of measuring certain things to see if you're likely to get the ROI from the visibility engagements that you're currently doing that you would want to get. That is a tool that I use with my clients, but I'm also, for folks who are listening here, you can use it for free. So it'll send you this great report that'll sort of explain what each of these things are. And we'll also probably put the link below. So if that is something that you want to sort of play with and test out, please, by all means, use those resources. And if you just want to connect with me, I am often on LinkedIn and Instagram. You can find me with my name on LinkedIn, and on Instagram, you can find me at the name of my business, which is NobiWorks. And that's generally where I'm hanging out if I'm not like being a nerd deep in like my research hobbit hole. So
Amazing. Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom, the research, your insights. This was magical. And hopefully we'll get to do it again sometime, because I feel like I said, we could talk for hours. So thank you for making the time.
my pleasure. Honestly, I am so flattered to have been invited. Thank you for having me. And yes, let's absolutely do this again.
I feel like I could have talked to Chloé for hours. I have such a deep respect for people that dig into the science and then translate it and help us practitioners, us small businesses, brands use science-based data and research to actually improve our brands. And Chloé's frameworks and insights are an amazing example of her brilliance. I hope that you will go and check out all of the links that she mentioned. We'll have them in the show notes. If you're ever looking for the show notes, you can just go to kputnam.com/podcast and you'll see all of our episodes there, including this one with Chloé. And let me know, what was your biggest aha moment from this episode? I know that there were many. Either send one of us a DM on Instagram or LinkedIn. Don't send me a DM on LinkedIn. I don't ever check mine, but I believe Chloé is more active there. Or if you're watching this on YouTube, leave me a comment there. I can't wait to hear. That course that Chloé mentioned is called the Brand Advantage, and it is available within my live Brand Clarity Collective. So if you're looking for that type of community and support and framework that she mentioned among all of my other signature brand building courses, you can find all of those in the Brand Clarity Collective. And I would love to support your brand building, whether you're in that initial stage or if you're a little bit farther along like she is now. Thanks for being here. Please keep sharing your genius. Keep working on getting your brand visible. Know that I am in your corner rooting for you loudly. Till next time, I will see you soon.